I'm going to talk about is building invincible companies. And it's a real pleasure to do this together with Rita McGrath, who's been a huge inspiration, over the years. So I want to thank Rita actually for having been such a, inspiration and friend over the years. Because I think today, innovation is really coming closer, if not interchangeable with strategy. Because if you don't do innovation, you're probably going to disappear from the face of the corporate world. And there's some indicators that that is happening. Now, invincible company sounds very arrogant, and it is, because no company can be invincible unless you actually admit that you're very vulnerable, and every company at one point dies. So Jeff Bezos likes to say that Amazon is going to die, and that's exactly why they reinvent themselves all the time. So Rita and I are going to try to show you a little bit, how do you become a little bit more invincible by reinventing yourself. So I'm going to make it interactive. So please take something to write. I'm going to have 1 and 2 minute exercises where you have to do something. And if you don't do it, maybe you're not going to be that successful with innovation. So you should probably participate. Now, invincible company, again, as I said, is something you earn every single day. And there are 3 characteristics of invincible companies. The first one is that invincible companies reinvent themselves all the time. So they don't wait to start with innovation. They don't wait for a disruption, because then it's too late. They constantly reinvent themselves while they're successful. That's the key here, while they're successful. Number 2, they don't just compete on technology, products, and services, because that's not enough. That's just to stay in the game. The best companies today, they build better business models. They outcompete others with better business models and constantly coming up with new business models. And the third one, and I think this is the hardest, they actually transcend industry boundaries. And to use Rita's terminology, they compete in arenas. They stop calling themselves banks or insurances or phone companies. They go beyond industry boundaries. And I'll give you an example in a second. Now, the challenge for established companies like your organizations is that you're not built to reinvent yourself. You're built to execute, right? So Vinod Khosla, co-founder of Sun Microsystems and now venture capitalist, likes to say that all interesting things happen at the edges of the system. And I think Rita's going to talk about that for sure. So this is a problem when you're an established company. Let me give you the example of car companies. And I have the pleasure to actually talk to the top leadership of one of the top 3 car companies in January. And here's what I'm going to tell them. The problem they have is that they see themselves as car companies. So no surprise that they get disrupted by an outsider. So you can love Tesla or you can hate Tesla, but you need to understand what Tesla is doing to car companies. So, car companies see, or executives in car companies see a competitor that builds electric vehicles. Oh, just another car company, electric vehicles. Yeah, it's different, but, car company. Well, maybe not. They are building cars and top of the rankings. You look at some of the articles in the Financial Times show they're the top seller in luxury vehicles. But to become successful, they used a different business model than just producing cars. They started building an infrastructure to address one of the biggest fears of consumers, running out of battery power, when you drive from the East Coast to the West Coast in the US, where they started out. So they built a supercharging infrastructure where you could charge your cars quickly. And funny enough, Citroën actually did that at the beginning of cars. They built the same thing, but no other company today has this kind of infrastructure, no other car company. So, well, is it a car company with infrastructure? Well, probably not. It's software first. So some researchers, some analysts, they already say that Tesla is becoming a software company that is selling subscriptions to features. And today already, you buy a car, you have the cameras, the sensors, but you don't get all the features. You have to unlock them. So Tesla's a software company first, starting to sell features as a subscription. And It's the company that collected most data on the planet when it comes to self-driving vehicles. So car companies are light years behind if you look at this. Now, it still kind of looks like a car company, software first, but is that it? Well, no, they're really transcending industry boundaries. They're putting solar panels on roofs of consumers. So they're selling solar panels. They're selling battery packs. Now you might say, well, but that's a tiny part of their business. That's true, but they're learning today how to satisfy consumers, how to scale this, while the car companies are just trying to figure out how to build electric vehicles at scale and sell them. So think of it. The established players are just trying to do what Tesla did in 2003. So Tesla has several years of advance because they're not thinking car company anymore. Do they have to get manufacturing right? Was that hard? For sure. But they're already thinking of the next hard thing. So what you need to understand as an established company is today, startups are better funded, take Tesla, good example, better funded than any corporate innovation team on the planet. Not entirely true. There may be 2% of companies that understand how this works. Because I'm not talking about R&D. I'm not talking about research and development. I'm talking about business R&D, building new value propositions and new business models. That's a different ballgame than research and development. So you need to understand that. So what do corporations say? We're going to buy innovation. We're going to buy these startups. It's getting more and more expensive. And some startup founders, they say, oh, big corporation, no, thank you. We're going to disrupt you. We're going to kill you. You're not going to buy us. Think of Discord, a company that got a $10 billion offer from Microsoft, and they said, no, thank you. So it's getting more and more expensive to buy growth, and to a certain extent, impossible. So you might say, well, okay, Tesla, technology company. It's not just something that startups do. Increasingly established companies are able to slowly transform, but we need to get better and faster at this. Hilti, good example. They used to build machine tools for builders and sell them to construction companies, and they became a service company that still builds machine tools for builders like drills, but that's not what they sell. They sell the logistics of managing a tool fleet for construction companies. So they just took away the biggest headache, but they had to shift from an old business model to a new one. We'll get to that in a bit. So there's three things I want to talk about. How does leadership enable better, more robust, more powerful innovation in established companies? So that's the first part, building innovation portfolios and what you need to do as a leader. The second part, what leaders can do, is actually build the innovation ecosystem by giving innovation structure and power. Because today, many innovation teams, they live literally in the basement of a company, and they report to the person who reports to the person who reports to the person who reports to the chief technology officer, who reports to the CEO. If innovation has no power, it doesn't happen. And the last one, I'll go a little bit into process if we have time. How do you actually do innovation? How do you test ideas before you build them to decrease the risk? Because innovation is only risky if you do it wrong. Let's start with leaders. Number one, in companies where leaders don't spend time on innovation, it does not happen. So take Logitech. I'm a big fan of Logitech at the moment. Bracken Darrell took over as CEO, infused entrepreneurial thinking in the company again. He spends 40 to 60% of his time on innovation. If the CEO does not spend at least 20 to 40% of their time on innovation, it will not happen. I actually call this the Rita McGrath test, because I remember learning from Rita, look at the CEO's agenda and you'll figure out what matters to the CEO. The second piece as a leader, here you have Gert de Winter, who's CEO of an insurance company in Switzerland, Valois Holding, about 7,500 people, so not too big, but still, not too small. He does another thing, not just spending time on innovation, but making it public and explicit. So he and his team share with the shareholders how much money they intend to reinvest. So typically, they say 60 to 80% of cash they will pay as dividends. That's the traditional approach. You want the safe haven dividends, but they also say that they're going to invest 10 to 30% in innovation publicly. They say that publicly, and then they do it, and they don't just stop there. They make the results public. So when they started out a couple of years ago, they said, from this investment, we will produce 1 billion Swiss francs, so it's approximately $1.2 billion, I guess, something like that, in valuation of investments by 2025. So as a leader, you need to take the time, but you also need to make public what you want to achieve, which seems risky, but if you don't, nobody will take it seriously, and you don't have the pressure that you need to actually make this happen. So what's the challenge? The challenge is many CEOs, they say, well, my job is to run the company. That's hard enough, which is true. But if you just in quotes run the company, you will miss the future. So you need to exploit what you have and explore the future at the same time. That's the key here. Now, let me show you how portfolios come in here. And I think Rita can also build on this afterwards. I'll give you an example of how a big German company, Bosch, with over 400,000 employees, actually built a portfolio of 19 innovations that succeeded. But the question is, how many projects did they need to invest in to get 19 winners? So this gentleman here, Uwe Kirschner, built the Bosch Accelerator program. And the goal there was to create business model innovations, not just technology innovation, not just R&D, but do business R&D to come up with new business models. I'm going to let Uwe give you a question, and then I want you to reflect on it and write down on a piece of paper what you think your answer is to that, and then I'll show you how they built this portfolio. So let's listen to Uwe for a second.
Hi there, my name is Uwe Kirschner.
Should be fine with a thumbs up if you can hear the sound.
I'm partner for Business Model Innovation.
Awesome.
And it's a pleasure to be the Invincible Company of the Month. What you see here is Bosch's research center in Renningen near Stuttgart. It represents Bosch's history, present, and certainly also the future. Traditionally, our organization has been very successful in the development of new technologies and new products. And certainly, this will also remain so in the future. In the year 2015, something very important happened. Our board of management decided to set up a competence center for business model innovation. The challenge was clear. We had to test many innovation ideas in a fast and capital efficient way. We wanted to find the very few innovation projects which have the potential to scale. Now the question to you, in order to reach that number of 19 innovation projects successfully exiting our Bosch Accelerator program, how many projects entered the validation phase? 19 innovation projects, 43, 108, 214, or even 926. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so you heard Uwe giving you the challenge. So the question to you is, write down how many projects do you think they invested 120,000 euro or approximately 130,000 US dollars into to get 19 winners? How many projects did they need to invest in? Which means all the other projects were killed. How many projects did they invest in and kill to get 19 winners? German conservative company. Was it 19? Smart people, right? Engineers, you would expect that they can pick the winners. Or was it 43, 108, 214, or 926? And that's the key question that any leader needs to ask today. How many projects do I need to invest in to get big winners? Because a small winner is not going to move the needle for a large company. So let's listen to Uwe answer this question, but show us how Bosch has done this. So let's have a quick look, and maybe it's surprising for some of you, maybe not. Let's see.
Yes, you're right. 214 innovation projects entered our validation engine, our Bosch Accelerator program. You've probably read the book, right? Let me give you some additional information around these 214 innovation projects which entered our Bosch Accelerator program. Phase 1 has an average duration of 3 months, including prep time. The average budget is 120,000 euros per team, and this already includes the personnel costs. After a very short period of time, and as I said, 3 months, we are able to successfully terminate 65% of all innovation projects. The remaining projects, in numbers 74, continued their journey in phase 2 of our program. The average team has a budget of 300,000 euros. And again, this includes, on one hand side, the personnel costs, but also the costs for the development and iteration of the MVP. And again, at the end of phase 2, a high number of innovation projects can be successfully terminated. We believe it's very important to ask the teams themselves whether they believe they're a go or no-go at the end of phase 1 and also at the end of phase 2 of the program, because this really brings responsibility to teams, and this also certainly drives cultural change in an organization. The go criteria, which we derive out of most recent methods and tools, are the foundation for a proper decision whether a team should stop or continue their journey. The success rate of the Bosch Accelerator program is around 10%, meaning that only 10% of the innovation projects are successfully exiting our Bosch Accelerator program. Now, you might argue that's a low number. I would disagree, because in explorative and adjacent innovations, you need to accept that the success rate is reasonably low. The purpose of the Bosch Accelerator program is to find those very few innovation projects which really have the potential to scale. Successful organizations, we do both. They run a portfolio of their existing core business and also a portfolio of their new business. Many innovation projects won't be successful, but a couple of innovation projects, if you have this proper validation process, should become part of your future core business. And who knows, maybe one or the other innovation project might be even inspired.
Okay, so you saw the answer might be surprising to some of you, but the key here to understand is that these 214 teams over 3 years, when they started, they got 3 months. And after 3 months, with this small, relatively small funding, I think it could even be less. This includes the salaries of the people. After 3 months, they successfully terminated 65%. In my words, that would be called, they killed 65% of the projects. In the German diplomatic way, they successfully retired. And that's important, not because, oh, these ideas didn't look great. These ideas didn't have legs. They couldn't show enough evidence. So they invested in a small part of these ideas, those that had evidence, and then the same thing again in a second phase. So what's really important here to understand is that the ability to kill projects that don't produce evidence allows you to optimize capital allocation. So you start with small investments and the bigger investments come at the end, which is the opposite of what you do in your exploit engine, where you're used to making big investments to get big returns. But that only makes sense when uncertainty is low. When uncertainty is high, you operate more like venture capital, small investments to get first proof, and you increase investments in less projects. Now, that's for a large company, so it might be kind of scary, but the same logic applies for smaller companies. Let me give you a Swiss company, Lorastar. They actually make steam irons, and it's a family-owned company, and the children took over, Mike and Julie, and they actually started building a portfolio. And the portfolio was built around one of their key competencies, which was managing steam. But they said, well, how else could we manage steam? What if we create a device as a steamer where we could disinfect clothes, hospital stuff, in hotels, or for children, for your children. So the goal was to build some growth engines besides their ironing business, where they manufactured and sold. So they started here knowing this is going to be disrupted with the first phase where they ideated. But they also knew ideas are free. They're everywhere. In innovation, ideas are the easiest part. We always talk about creativity. Creativity is the easiest part in innovation. But what they then did is they took 14 ideas, they narrowed it down to 3 teams that went into what we call an innovation sprint, exploring 3 different directions. And they knew that only one direction would really make sense. So that one direction is what they then transferred to the exploit portfolio, which they are scaling. So the same logic applies in smaller companies or in business units, just like in a bigger company. But you can't expect $1 billion return from 14 ideas and 3 teams. So otherwise, there's a little bit of delusion there going on. Now let's go into innovation ecosystems and structure. So the key here to understand is that these 2 worlds that, for a long time, we've called this the ambidextrous organization. And only now slowly companies are starting to put this in place. How can I be world-class at managing the existing exploit and world-class at exploring the future at the same time? That's hard. It's not about replacing your culture that is world-class at execution, but it's creating an additional culture. So let's have a quick look on how these cultures are different. Well, the focus on the right-hand side, managing the existing. On the left-hand side, it's about creating the future. Now, why are they different? Because uncertainty on the right-hand side is relatively low and predictable. You know the customers, you know the value propositions, you know your channels, you know your supply chain. So on that side, you can improve and predictability is high. You go into new markets with new value propositions, new technologies, potentially new business models, predictability is low. So you have to act in a different way. And what I already showed you with Bosch is that even the financial philosophy changes. On the right-hand side, you make safe bets, you pay dividends. And you might remember Geert de Winter of Baloise, they pay some dividends, but they also say we're going to, with the other 10 to 30%, build a risk portfolio where you can get a return on the portfolio, but you can't guarantee per project what's going to work. And then, and I'm going to get out of the way here so we can see the slide, culture and processes, substantially different cultures. On the right-hand side, you manage something that is a little bit more linear. And even if you do agile, it's not agile. Doing agile doesn't mean you're inventing the future. It means you're working in an agile way. On the left-hand side, it's all about experimentation. It's about what we've seen with Bosch, about many projects that will go nowhere. Failure is normal. It's never the goal. It's always annoying. But in innovation, you can't avoid failure. Because if you have no failure, I can guarantee you, you're not innovating. And then, obviously, last one, people and skills. On the right-hand side, you need managers, world-class managers. And on the left-hand side, you need world-class explorers. You could also say entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs. Both are hard, but they're different hard. They require different education, and they require a completely different experience. You don't become a world-class explorer by running a business unit. Running a business unit is hard, but you learn things that are irrelevant to actually inventing the future. So even business education, and I'm sure Rita can talk about that a little bit because Rita is, training the next generation of innovation leaders. That is hard. Now, I talked a lot. I talked for 22 minutes. I want you to work. So I'm going to give you a very short 2-minute exercise, thinking exercise. As a leader, you need to understand the difference between exploit and explore. So I created 3 categories. One is exploit, managing the existing, category 3. Category 1 is inventing the future, high uncertainty. And then there's category 2, where things might fall in both buckets. So I'm going to give you several sticky notes, and I want you, they all have letters. I want you to put those sticky notes in the right buckets. So allocate the letters to the numbers. So I'm all going to put them in the middle to start. Embracing failure. Does that go in bucket 1, 2, or 3? Next one. Regular dividends, regular financial dividends. Bucket 1, 2, or 3? Predictability, 1, 2, or 3? Iterative processes. Does that go in bucket 1, 2, or 3? Financial targets, does that go in 1, 2, or 3? Same thing. Risk reduction, reducing the risk, where does that go? Innovation, where does that go? Rapid decision making, and then the last one, linear processes. So, and I put a couple of trick questions there, so I wasn't entirely fair. So let's have a look. In which buckets do these things go? So let's start with financial targets. Financial targets actually go onto both sides, but in a different way. On the right-hand side, we have quarterly targets that we can plan and that we can meet. On the left-hand side, we have portfolio targets because we can't know if a project is going to succeed, but we can have a ratio because we know, if you think back to Bosch, that 10% of the projects we invest in are probably going to succeed, 10%. And we can start to get a number on that. So we use portfolio to diversify the risk, and that gives us a more certain return. So different types of financial targets. Regular dividends, clearly on the right-hand side. So we've seen that with Baloise. On the left-hand side, we have rapid decision-making. Why? Because on the left-hand side, you're first going to make small investments and you let the team work with the money, autonomy. You give them $500,000 and then you stay out of the way. On the right-hand side, you might make big investments, and there you need to think much harder because they're irreversible. You might build a new supply chain, a new factory. That's an irreversible decision where you take your time. It's okay to take your time there. Innovation actually goes in both because there are different types of innovation. So on the right-hand side, we have efficiency innovation, making your processes better, making your existing business model better. That's okay, that's important, but it's not enough. On the left-hand side, you have to work on a more transformative innovation, new growth, new business models, embracing failure. On the right-hand side, we don't want failure. Your supply chain can't just stop for 2 days. That's not an option. On the left-hand side, you don't aim for failure, but you need to embrace it. So remember, 90% of your projects are going to fail in innovation to create 10% really big winners. That is actually a very, very good ratio already. And then here, next one that I'm going to bring up is risk reduction. Again, let me get out of the way here. Goes for both. On the right-hand side, it's avoiding disruption risk. And on the left-hand side, it's avoiding innovation risk. Innovation risk means investing in ideas that are stupid because at the beginning, you actually don't know if it's a good idea or bad idea because they all look good in a PowerPoint and in a spreadsheet. And then over here, iterative processes, very much on the right. Linear processes, even if you're agile, very much on the right. So I hope you got some of these right. One more basic thing to understand when you're designing your portfolio and creating the structure and asking where should innovation live, on the right-hand side, you have efficiency innovation. In the middle, you have sustaining innovation, which is making the existing business model better, maybe with new products, new value propositions, new channels, digital transformation. And then on the very left-hand side, you have transformative innovation, new business models, completely new growth. You need to do all three, except if you're growing so fast and you're so much ahead of the curve that you can afford on the right-hand side. But think of Tesla. While they're building their first growth engine, they're just scaling, building electric vehicles. They're already working on the business model of a solar energy company or home solar, right? So think of it. Now, just to give a quick example to make this a little bit more concrete, efficiency innovation at Amazon is building better warehouses with robotics and artificial intelligence. I would say the Kindle was a sustaining innovation when they digitized books. That was nothing else than actually turning an old business model into a slightly better new one. And transformative innovation would be Amazon Web Services, where an e-commerce retailer becomes one of the biggest forces in IT infrastructure. Think of it. Now, there's one exercise I like doing with senior leadership teams and boards. I ask them, what types of innovations do you have? And I get everybody, so maybe you can do this as homework after our session with Rita and myself. You write down your favorite innovations, the results that you've achieved at your company, not ideas, real results, real outcomes, real innovations that made it all the way to execution. Write them down, and then you put them into these buckets. Which ones are efficiency innovation? Which ones is sustaining? Which one's transformative? Now, I do this a lot with leadership teams, and then what comes out is, well, those that weren't sustaining, probably they're just efficiency. And then I say, oh, well, you seem to have something like Amazon Web Services over here. They say, well, Alex, that's just an idea. Well, then, if it's just an idea, I wanted results, then it shouldn't be there. So this is the picture you often see. And I have no value judgment. All I ask them is this what you wanted? That all of your investments go in improving a dying business model. So I'm often provocative, right? So building a better car that is, with all the best features, that is just improving a dying business model, because look at regulation. You won't be able to sell normal cars anymore, or conventional cars. We're moving towards electric vehicles. So that is the key question to ask. Sometimes companies win prizes for innovation, but they don't realize it's all here. You might use crazy new technology, investing in blockchain and NFT, but if you're just improving a dying business model, it's not enough. And I'm joking, but that's actually what I see all the time with leadership teams. They say, wow, we didn't even realize that we're not building the future. So here's a reflection that I want you to think of. Have a quick thought, where does innovation live in your organization? And then I'll give you an example. Because today, this is one of the challenges. It's not just the tools. It's not just that you need a portfolio. It's actually the org structure. There's a huge problem that innovation doesn't have enough power. So where does innovation, not research and development, but where does innovation, new business models, new growth, where does that live? Who's responsible, and where is that in your org chart? Now, I'm going to give you a provocative example with Ping An. It's one of my favorite examples. So they used to be a traditional financial conglomerate, insurance and banking. And then their founder, Peter Ma, said, we're going to get killed by technology companies. We need to become a technology company. And what he did is say, I'm going to be chairman and CEO, but I'm going to appoint a co-CEO, which I like to call the chief entrepreneur, who has one job, is to build the future, not to manage the present, no existing business models, just in quotes, build the future. So Jessica Tan had this task as a co-CEO, and they actually experimented with the org structure. And Peter Ma said, well, I'm going to move back towards become only chairman, and I'm going to put in place a 3 co-CEO team where Jessica Tan is going to keep the job of inventing the future because she was really good at it and still is. And he would put in place another co-CEO to manage many of the existing business models, the assets that they have, and a person who would be more the bridge builder between the two. So think of it, 3 co-CEOs, and everybody always says co-CEO never works. Well, it depends, because they all had very distinct and clearly different tasks. They didn't have to fight over territory, because once an idea is big enough, guess what? It moves out of the exploration. Once you reach a certain stage, it's not exploration, it's pure management. So it should become an exploit model. Now, one more illustration of how not to do it and how to do it. So at Best Buy, you might know, American retailer selling technology products, they were on a bad path and going towards bankruptcy. And the company brought in a new CEO, Hubert Joly, who actually just published a book this year called The Heart of Business. Really interesting book that you should absolutely buy as a leader and follow his advice. He didn't use the traditional cost cutting when he came in. He said, people are part of the solution, not part of the problem. To completely transform the company in two phases. First, fix the core, and then invent the future. But he also learned something about innovation. Whoops, that was a bit too fast. He learned something about innovation. A mistake that he publicly admitted. I'm going to show you the video. He was in one of our webinars. He said that he thought innovation could live in the core business. And that was a big mistake because it turns out, well, in the core business, you're running the core business. Nobody has time for innovation. So let's listen to Hubert and see which solution they put in place.
For a while I was expecting that the organization that's in charge of running the business would be able to innovate. And here's the scoop. If you're running a $50 billion company, 100,000 people, there's a promotion every month. There's no capacity. So a breakthrough moment was when we established the Strategic Growth Office. About 50 people led by Corey Barry, who later on became my successor. So really staffed with top-notch people, 100% dedicated to identifying which opportunities, prototyping, piloting, testing, and then looking at scaling.
So in this case, he appointed Corey Barry to start building the growth part of the business and giving her power. And what's really interesting, she is today the CEO of Best Buy. So think of it. Traditionally, we take chief operating officers and chief financial officers and we make them CEO because in the past, most important was to run a business. But now, most important is to build the future. Running a business is the best path towards self-destruction. What you really need is entrepreneurial CEOs. Entrepreneurs, CEOs who understand what it means to build the future and not just in quote, because I'm not saying that's easy, managing the present. So a couple of insights there. Now let me spend the last 10 minutes on the process of an innovation culture. And I think I mismanaged time a bit. I think my stopwatch kind of ran out, but I'll show you just one thing. We won't go into competing on business models, but I want to show you one more thing about testing. When we go from idea to real business, there are two main tasks that you need to understand. And risk and uncertainty is high when you start with an idea. You don't know if it's going to work. So your only task is actually to reduce risk. How do you do that? By making small experiments and bigger experiments later on. Exactly what Bosch did, right? Small experiments like talking to customers, very cheap. It just costs your time. And then bigger experiments like building prototypes later on. And the process has two phases, business design and testing. Business design is about coming up with better business models. And that is actually something people are not very good at, coming up with better business models. But here's the key. It doesn't stop there. While you design as if you were right, you actually need to understand something that in innovation and entrepreneurship, there's a fine line between vision and hallucination. So Steve Blank, good friend, entrepreneur, and now also turned educator, built several businesses. He shows that great ideas on paper, and I'm going to stop with this last counter example. Better Place had a similar vision to Tesla. They wanted to spread electric vehicles around the world. And what they said is the biggest pain is charging the car. So I'd have to plug in here and wait for 40 minutes. That's annoying. What if I could drive into a battery swapping station, drive in, change the battery in 3 minutes and drive out? Looked amazing on paper. They raised $850 million. They built the infrastructure, which is the most expensive experiment you can do. And that's what Better Place is today. So while Tesla succeeded because they have testing in their DNA, they actually tested all of their ideas. Well, turns out you need to do that second bubble, which is, and I'll stop with this, asking yourself what needs to be true for your idea to work. And like a scientist, you're going to come up with your hypothesis and then experiment, run those experiments, learn, and maybe completely change the idea. And that is what companies are not so good yet. Very good at designing ideas, putting them into PowerPoints, not so good at going through this double loop all the time to reduce the risk of uncertainty in order to succeed.